Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We'll just give everyone a minute to log in here. And It's good to see everybody. We have a lot of familiar faces, some familiar names, those of you who have cameras off. It's good to see everyone. And I'll just ask our moderator if you can just give me a thumbs up if everybody's logged in. And if so, we will start. Okay. Um, Great. Well, great. I'll just go ahead and introduce our speaker, Elliot Chodoff, who um, I'll be asking you a lot of questions, but I'll just frame
Okay.
the conversation here. And Before I do, I'll just answer the first question we got in the chat. Will the recording be made available later? Yes, we'll be making the recording available as we do for all of our leadership sessions. So I'll just say a few words about what we're doing here for those who haven't joined our monthly leadership sessions. But My name is Alan Levine. Those of you who don't know me, CEO of Hasbara Fellowships, and um, as you know, our focus is uh, fighting back against anti-Semitism and anti-Israel propaganda on college campuses. And the way we do that primarily is by empowering the students. And I see some of our Hasbara fellows on the line here who were with us in Israel this last December. We had 80 students with us, and the whole focus of our time in Israel is learning the facts on the ground so that we can come back and articulate Israel's story and the Jewish people's story as we fight back against anti-Semitism on our college campuses. And More recently, we developed these sessions on Zoom to continuing education, be able to really educate ourselves and engage with some of our favorite educators that we meet in Israel, like Elliot Chodoff, and other thought leaders, and we've had journalists and elected officials and so forth on these leadership sessions with us. And so for today, I am thrilled to invite Elliot Chodoff, who has been with us quite a few times. And those of you, the students that were with us in Israel this last December, you spent a day with him up in the Golan Heights, as so many of our students have done over the years. And Elliot is a major in the reserves of the Israel Defense Forces and a now retired professor of military science at the University of Haifa. And so, as a professor and an IDF official, you really understand where our students come from with life on college campuses, and you understand the strategy on the ground and the security challenges facing America and Israel, and you understand how to communicate them on college campuses. So you've always been one of my favorite educators, Elliot, and it's great to have you
Thank you.
here via Zoom. So welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So I'm going to dive into the discussion, which we said we'll do in interview format here, and because I had a lot of questions, and so instead of a big briefing, I wanted to dive right in, and I'm going to ask you first about Iran. Then we'll go to the Gaza peace board, and if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about what's going on with the Saudis. So there's sort of just in the
Okay.
last couple of weeks a lot of news in the region. All of it affects Israel and America. Israel more closely, of course. Um, and I know everyone in this audience has been following the news, so we won't. I don't think anyone in our audience needs sort of the 101. But we're interested in the analysis. You know, what factors are you looking at? What do you
Yes.
think will happen? I know you say never predict, but
No.
we do want to analyze. And so let me start with Iran, which you know, protests a couple of weeks ago, there was talk of maybe the regime falling. We've seen protests were suppressed, um, no defections among the security forces, as far as at least what we can see in the news, no major defections. There's still, it seems, potentially an attack, but also some negotiations led by Steve Witkoff with the Iranians. And so, um, hoping you can just kind of bring us up to speed and where do things stand now, and what factors are you looking at as you try to make sense of it all?
Okay. So first of all, I think there are four issues that concern us And there are supposed to be negotiations tomorrow between the U.S. representatives and the Iranians. One of the issues is certainly not on the agenda, and that is the abortive uprising that has apparently failed. And I'll come back to that. The main issue, at least as far as what's being publicized, is the Iranian nuclear program. And the Americans also want on the agenda Iran's ballistic missile program and its support for terrorist organizations around the Middle East. The Iranians have said they're not going to discuss the last two. The Americans, at least according to the New York Times, which I think is 50-50. In other words, believe them or not, we'll see, that the Americans have quietly said that it will be on the agenda. The Iranians have publicly said it will not be on the agenda. So we'll see. But those are the four issues. Where anybody's been following the news, and as you say, going over it on a day by day, the news has been hysterical. Every day there's going to be a strike. Every day it's going to happen. It's going to happen tonight. It's going to happen last night. It's going to happen tomorrow night, and just ongoing. And part of that is just news hype, but part of it is also a consequence of the Trump method of doing international business. And here I have to say, and I don't get into American politics. I do get into American policy. What has been going on with Iran from the United States over the past month and change is extremely dangerous, not only vis-a-vis Iran, but vis-a-vis the Middle East and vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And for that, I want to take a step back. And I want to start by saying that even I think I just finished a short lecture tour in the States. I was traveling around, speaking mostly to Christian audiences who are, I would say, innately, basically Republican pro-Trump. But even his most loyal supporters will agree, at best, he's erratic. And that may work in the real estate world. It's less good in the international relations world. Now, I argue that the rules of international coercive diplomacy are exactly the same rules as raising children. Set limits, be consistent, and never make a threat that you're not willing to carry out. And Trump has violated all three. So what that means is that his credibility is down. That doesn't mean he won't strike. And I want to be very clear on this. Nobody knows what's going to be tomorrow, the next day, the day after that. And I'll talk a bit about the negotiations and what they may mean. But by behaving the way he's been behaving, vis-a-vis not just Iran, but in general, the chances of having to use violence goes up, because the threat that you make when you don't have credibility is not taken seriously. And of course, at one point or another, you either have to walk away or follow through. So that's sort of the immediate context. I want to start by going back. You mentioned the uprising. I think we discussed it in our last webinar, but I have to tell you, I've been doing so many, I'm not sure it was with us. So I have a fundamental rule about uprisings and revolutions, and that is that they succeed when the rebels have more people willing to die than the regime is willing and able to kill. And the Iranian regime certainly showed its willingness to kill. It showed its ability to kill. And since the military, I'm not talking about the IRGC, which is a hardcore regime, but since the military stayed and didn't change sides, their ability to kill stayed very high. Now, I believe that regime change, as it's called, has to come from within. In other words, what I'm about to say is not that America or Israel should somehow cause regime change in Iran. I think that's a failed strategy. As we saw, it failed in Iraq, it failed in Afghanistan, it's failed in other places. Outsiders coming in and overthrowing the regime and hoping that everything's going to work out is a very, very bad strategy. However, if a rebellion slash uprising is already in the works, and these tend to form in real time, in other words, the uprising in Iran was not planned by rebel organizations that took the opportunity. It was a genuine grassroots opposition to the regime, to its economic situation. I wasn't bashing Trump. I'm an equal opportunity basher. It reached a certain point, and here I'm going to do another bashing, so get used to it. When Trump announced to the protesters, keep demonstrating, step it up, help is on the way, and help didn't show up, that was catastrophic. The regime promised him that it wasn't going to continue to kill, it wasn't going to continue to execute. America backed down. We're learning the numbers now, and we don't know what they are. The estimates go into the high estimates go into the 60s and even 70s of thousands of protesters killed. I don't know that that's accurate. 30 plus certainly seems accurate. So guesstimate for yourself. They're still executing people. They're still rounding people up. And that uprising is over. In other words, the regime showed that it's willing to kill and is able to kill more than the protesters were willing to lose. It is possibility that had America and Israel, Israel and others struck at that moment, and not a symbolic strike, a strategically correct strike to help the uprising against the apparatus of the repression. I'm talking about IRGC communications, IRGC intelligence, organizing, in other words, weakening them physically so that rebels might have been able to take certain areas and forces not be shifted against them. Perhaps that would have been the point where at least part of the army would have gone over to the rebellion, because the army's interest, by the way, always in these cases is to stay with the winner. As long as the army perceived the government was going to win, they were going to stay with the government. The minute the army perceives that the government isn't winning, it begins to crack and move over to the other side. This is a repeated pattern throughout the world. This is not an Iranian phenomenon. And it didn't happen. To start all over again now is extremely difficult. Once again, we're not talking about an organization that can be told, okay, start another uprising. To generate that kind of groundswell, grassroots movement after having lost so many, after the regime is now on top of many of the rebels, is going to be extremely difficult. I don't speak in terms of possible, impossible. Nothing is impossible. But in my opinion, that opportunity was lost. And those who want to see regime change in Iran are now going to have to wait for the next one. And that's not happening, in my opinion, in the next weeks and months, no matter what America does.
And let me just jump in with a question here, Elliot, which is right. It's it seems like that's the sort of what we're hearing from experts and commentators and so forth. It's definitely I'll just make a comment on the human side of it. We've so many Persian American, Persian Jewish students here at Hasbarad. Certainly, anyone who's, especially in the New York or LA areas, so many people from that community, and I think we were all hoping, and obviously for Israel's security and America's security, for many reasons, really hoping the regime would fall. But it definitely seems like the iron was hot a couple of weeks ago, and that moment has passed, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And so priorities now. I heard you say a minute ago, the Americans want the ballistic missile and the nuclear program of Iran and support for proxies around or support for proxies around the Middle East. All of that on the agenda as they negotiate now. But I would assume Israel priorities are they totally in line with the White House's priorities, or is Israel prioritizing one issue over the rest?
No, I don't think it's a question of prioritizing. If we want to talk strategically down the road, the nuclear threat is obviously the greatest threat to Israel's existence. But the ballistic missile threat is almost tied into it. In other words, the ability to put a nuclear warhead on ballistic missiles and fire them at Israel um, is kind of it's built in. In other words, one without the other. The ballistic missiles are a threat. We saw that during the campaign, the recent campaign, the so-called 12-day war, which wasn't a 12-day war. Um, so that's a concern. But I would put it in that order. In other words, number one, the nuclear capability, reaching nuclear weapons capability for Iran makes it immediately existential to Israel. The ballistic missiles being able to hit Israel even without nuclear weapons can be extremely damaging, as we've seen. And the support for proxies, I think, is a mixed bag because let's say that Iran, we call Iran the head of the snake, but this is a multi-headed snake. Iran is let me see if I can break this down quickly. For Hezbollah, Iran is critical. Hezbollah is part of Iran. It's part of the IRGC. So, A, I don't see Iran stopping support for them, and B, even if Iran were taken out of the picture, so if it were, Hezbollah would go down with it. Hamas, on the other hand, is not. Hamas is a proxy. It's supported by Qatar. It's supported by Turkey. It could be supported by others like Pakistan. So Iran being cut or Hamas being cut off from Iran might hurt it, but it wouldn't be an existential threat to Hamas or to Islamic Jihad. Uh, who else is out there? The Houthis, the rebels in Iraq and Syria, much lower level threats. The fact that they're Shiites makes them a little bit less likely to get support from other places. But Iraq, for example, is a Shiite country. It would support them. And it's not at all clear to me that Qatar wouldn't support them as well in fighting Israel. So getting Iran out of that picture would be a good thing, but I don't think it would be a do or die for most of these groups.
So I'm hearing ballistic missiles and nuclear are sort of bigger priorities at the moment.
Right.
And how, I mean, do you see us, and by us I mean the Western world, both America and Israel and free people everywhere, do you see us having a chance here at making real progress, really striking down, or even if such a thing as permanent exists, permanently ending the nuclear and ballistic missile programs at this time? Can we, or in other words, can this opportunity still be used for something? And if so, how do you see it playing out?
Okay, so first of all, I think it can be. The Iranians are weaker today than they were, let's say, a year ago, 2 years ago. They're more vulnerable, and that's why the American threat is being taken as seriously as it is. And here again, especially after America's participation and the bombing of Iran, and this is kind of the positive flip to what I said earlier. When he made the threat and carried it out, it made him that much more credible in terms of his threats today. It's not a total one way or the other. So moving forces, moving aircraft carriers, making public threats has a value. The Iranians, and here Trump is absolutely right. The Iranians don't want to get struck again. That's not exactly an epiphany. Nobody wants to be bombed. So what the Iranians are doing at the moment is what one would expect them to do. Stop and say, hey, let's talk about this. Now, are they serious? They are excellent negotiators. We've seen that over the years. And on top of that, their credibility is very low, and that's something the West seems to forget over and over again. In other words, the Iranians make agreements and they lie through their teeth and they violate them. They don't violate them spectacularly, they violate them quietly, and the world sort of lets them get away with it. So the answer to your question is an agreement would be a very good thing. Its enforcement regime is critical. And I think ultimately, if this breaks down, it'll be on that. In other words, the Iranians can say, yeah, we'll stop our ballistic missile program over 500 kilometers. How do you show that the weapons that they're making don't have 1,000-kilometer range when they say they're 500 kilometers?
Mm-hmm.
How do you guarantee it?
Right.
And so they test one and they say, well, we're just testing it. We're not really putting it into production. How do you prove that they're not? And etc. So I think that an agreement is a good thing. A strict enforcement inspection regime is critical to the agreement. And even in that case, and here I'm talking about nuclear as well as ballistic missiles, I would presume they're cheating. And all the agreement will really do is slow them down. And then the question is how much will it slow them down over how much time? And then sort of the question beyond that, what does the West, and in this case America, do a year, 2, 3, 4, 5 down the road when they find that the Iranians have been cheating? And guess what? They're now on the verge of nuclear weapon development, design, ballistic missile production. We suddenly find that they've got 5,000 ballistic missiles with 3,000-kilometer ranges and so on.
So I'll ask one last question on Iran, which is just, you are an Israeli decision maker in the IDF, and you report to some of the top echelons in the Israeli government and the IDF.
Whether they listen to me or not is a different question.
So, well, what are you advising them, and what are they? Where would you go from here, from your seat in Israel?
Look, Israel today, as the consequence of pretty close to 2 decades of poor strategic decision making, is at the moment totally dependent on the United States. And I don't think it's surprising that Netanyahu made the statement recently that he wants to make Israel more independent than it has been. The fact is that 25, 30 years ago, Israel was more independent than it is today. And it was poor decision making that led to that dependency. And here I don't want to be misunderstood. America's support for Israel is critical. America's friendship and Israel's friendship with America, critical. I'm talking about dependency on the level of we don't have tank shells, and if America doesn't supply them, we have no ammunition for our tanks. It's that level of dependency. Mm-hmm. That when the Biden administration said we're withholding the shipment of heavy aerial bombs, the Air Force was running short on aerial bombs. The artillery shells that we were firing a year into the war, we didn't have at the outbreak of the war. In my opinion, and it's not just mine, those are all the consequences of very, very poor decision-making over the past couple of decades, because we had the capability, we used to produce these things, and we stopped in order to have them purchased through the foreign military sales, the so-called aid package that was being gotten from America. And here, having said that, I have to say something, just interject, because there's a lot of misunderstanding. The American aid to Israel in this package comes to foreign military credits of $3.8 billion a year. That sounds like a lot of money. The Israeli military budget is $40 billion a year. In other words, the American aid nominally makes up less than 10% of the Israeli budget, of the Israeli military budget, defense budget. The Israeli government budget is $200 billion a year. When I don't want to go into all the intricacies of it, but the actual value in dollars of the American aid is less than 3.8. In other words, Israel is perfectly capable, not immediately because that's not how budgets work, but is perfectly capable of absorbing that cost into its own economy.
Mm.
Having done that, it would certainly purchase things from the United States. And here again, the relationship is critical. Israel's going to be producing F-35s or F-15s or F-16s or things like that. On the other hand, many things that Israeli companies, government and private, used to produce for the IDF, they stopped producing because Israel decided to get those things from America using the military credits, and that killed major portions of Israel's armaments industries.
Mm.
That's a deep background to today when America, particularly current administration, but it was also last administration, says you will do it this way or else Israel has to do it this way. And therefore, Israel's ability to act independently, and we saw this in the aftermath of Gaza, Lebanon, and Iran, the shots are being called in Washington, and Israel has to follow very, very closely, because if not, it won't have ammunition to fight in a month from now.
But I do. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but there seems to be still a lot of very good collaboration between the Israeli government and this White House, and some have described it as Ron Dermer walks in and his ideas are automatically at least taken very seriously, right? And so, the
But
question
keep in mind that Ron Dermer isn't around anymore.
is that correct? I know what is that actually correct? Because I've
It's official.
right
Yeah.
officially, but is he let's talk unofficially for a second since we're just friends and family. I mean, he's not to get us onto a tangent about Ron Dermer, but well, maybe in Q&A you can expand on that. But
Okay.
if you were advising the Israeli government and you were on a mission to the White House to plan and discuss, I mean, what's the message right now?
Okay. So here again, let's make a distinction between immediacy and politics and institutional relationships. Israel and the United States have a very, very deep institutional relationship. It's two-way. You hear it clearly, whether it's the CEOs of the aircraft companies that make the F-35, F-15, and F-16, who say things like, what we're getting from Israel is worth tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars in R&D, years of R&D, and so on. That's purely on the production end. On the military end, look, we use American equipment, and we use it high intensity in combat. Remember, the first combat missions of the F-35 were Israeli, flown by the Israeli Air Force, and significantly against Russian and Chinese air defenses. In other words, we are flying American equipment, granted hybrid because there's some Israeli technology in there, avionics, and Israeli pilots, of course, but we are flying them against the defenses that America would be flying against in a war. Okay, so in other words, it's a one-to-one. It's not a hypothetical test. It's a one-to-one test. That is critical to American military strategic planning. And so the point I'm making is not just, America gets stuff from Israel. If you're an American general, an American Air Force general, an American Army general who's involved in stuff that we also learn and teach along the way, this relationship is deep. It's not this week's policy. The higher you go into the system, and once again, this is not unique to this administration. The higher you go into the system, the more politics get involved. Politics are much more short term, especially Western democratic politics. let's say
I'll make sure to ask all the questions for the chat and at the end if you which I know you tell us when you're in person you like to be interrupted with questions, but
no,
we're
no,
compiling all those in the
look,
chat.
okay, look. When I talk about politics and Western politics, understand I'm talking about the immediacy of time frame. Iran has no immediacy in its politics. They don't face elections every 2 to 4 years. Western politics is much more immediate, and therefore its actions are much more immediate. And again, I'm not speaking about the current administration exclusively. I'm talking about going all the way back, and therefore it's a kind of split personality relationship where on the one hand the professional relationship with let's say the U.S. military for our purposes is a much longer term, deeper, stable relationship, where the political relationship between the political echelons of the countries is much rockier. It has to do with personalities. Two generals may not get along, but they're going to work together because it's military. Two politicians don't get along, and we can use the the Netanyahu Obama case as a sharp example, and it's going to have an effect on policy. If they do get along, and I'm intentionally not speaking currently, Rabin Clinton, then you have a whole different approach to the relationship. Now, is it absolute? In other words, does America or Israel go from one end to the other on this? No, but it can cause a shift, 10%, 15%, 20%, when the chips are down, and sort of the long way around to answer your question. Israel can't afford to irritate or contradict a president like Trump, as others have learned along the way as well. So not exclusively Israel, because he's capable of taking it very personally. And some in the past have, and some in the past haven't. Again, it's not exclusively Trump phenomenon. Basically, now you have to say yes no matter what he says.
Okay. But I think Israelis, I would think, probably could take comfort in his record and the fact that the ballistic missile and nuclear
absolutely
program are at the top of the agenda right now, as Steve Witkoff goes.
Absolutely. Okay. Again, I don't want this to sound like, oh, Trump is terrible. From a strategic planning point of view, and this is not just me speaking, right. He's problematic. He's unpredictable. Unpredictable may be very good right. in certain ways. It's less good in other ways.
Right. And the reason we see you every time we're in Israel is we get the deeper analysis, right? We're not here for the
right.
superficial slogans and sort of campaigning, politic. So we know where you're coming from with all this analysis. And I want to switch gears and talk about the Gaza Peace Board, which I've kind of heard everything from. This is a new United Nations, which would mean it is something radically new. From Israel's perspective, maybe kind of exciting, right? The UN's always been the biggest, most anti-Israel place in the world. But then we've heard Palestinian Authority officials being put on the Stabilization Force board and on the Technocratic Committee. And now we saw a report about a new logo that looks exactly like the PA's logo, the Palestinian Authority's logo as well. So,
right.
Which for Israelis would mean, oh, Oslo all over again. We're back. So on the one hand, new United Nations. On the other hand, we're back in 1993, just doing Oslo again, and just handing the keys to what in effect is Yasser Arafat's people. So which
yes.
is it? How are you reading this? And to what extent are you optimistic on the future?
All right, and this one I'm going to say too soon to tell. And I think that's a fair answer. The original quote of "too soon to tell" goes back to the 1970s with Henry Kissinger meeting with Zhou Enlai and asking him what he thought of the outcome of the French Revolution, and Zhou Enlai said, "I don't know, too soon to tell." So I'm not going that far,
right.
But look, I'm much more hands-on, on the ground kind of a guy. What I want to know is who's going to disarm Hamas.
Mhm.
And until that question is answered, the Peace and Stability new UN board is just a lot of talk.
Mhm.
If and when Hamas is truly dismantled, disarmed, not just a veneer of they hand over a few weapons, but continue producing stuff underground as they are doing now as we speak. The tunnel network ripped up, dismantled, the shipping / smuggling of weapons and equipment from Egypt shut down. Until all of that happens, we are back in pre-October 7th again. And if it doesn't happen, then we're in Oslo 2.0.
Mhm.
If it does happen, then that's when we'll really have to assess, what does this board really mean? Are they going to go in with the best interests of the Gazans in mind, in which case I don't care who sits on the board?
Mhm.
Or are they going to go in for their own interests, Turkey, Qatar, the Palestinian Authority, in which case it matters who sits on the board, and it's not going to be a peace board at all?
Is there any real threat of for some reason, somehow, this idea of Turkish or Qatari soldiers or at least operators really infiltrating and being on the ground there? I know there's some Turks in Gaza now, I believe, running institutions,
Right.
soldiers though.
Right.
Talk to us about that a little bit.
There are two possibilities of that happening, I think. One, once again, America imposes it, and Israel is not in a position to refuse. Negotiate, okay, not 10,000 Turkish troops, only 1,000 Turkish troops, whatever it is. The moment they're in, one will become two, and two will become five, and five will become 10. The Turks would like nothing better to be able to put soldiers back into the Middle East against Israel better than anything, but not just that. Erdogan has made very clear over the years that he wants to reestablish the Ottoman Empire. What better way to do that than to get a foothold somewhere in the Middle East? And Gaza is just as good as any. So, in other words, it's a threat to Israel, but it's a threat to the region.
I'll ask you one more follow up on Gaza, which is that we saw, the Rafah, uh, the border crossing open again, but with Israeli.
Yes.
I believe the word is not control; it's Israeli supervision. Is that correct?
Oversight from a distance, yes.
And I know something, just to bring everyone up to something you've taught us over the years, and we went into this a lot as well. When I want to say about a year and a half ago, when we had MK Danny Luzon, was the goal of securing Rafah. It was what, April 2024 during the war, when Israel actually went
Yes.
into Rafah, and something that you've taught our Hasbara fellows over the years many times, and we've really gone into this, is that during the 18 years or so of Hamas control of Gaza, that the problem was not as much the Gaza border with Israel; it was Gaza's border with Egypt, and the inability to prevent smuggling uh,
Correct.
into Gaza all these years.
Inability or unwillingness.
Well, for Israel, it was okay. We'll let you
No, I'm talking about
articulate
on the
that.
Egyptian
Um,
side.
right,
On
right,
the
right. On the
Egyptian
Egyptian
side.
side, but right, but I would think from Israel, you have to assume unwillingness all over the Middle East, and you have to, right. The Israeli thinking is protect our
Okay.
own borders and do it ourselves, right? And so,
Right.
how significant is it now that it's open now, the Rafah crossing? The IDF has at least some control. Is that kind of establishing facts on the ground, and whatever happens next with the peace board and sort of in diplomatic discussions, we'll let it all play out. But either way, IDF has that area secured. Is that kind of how you're looking at it?
Secured is overstating it. No country has ever thoroughly succeeded in preventing smuggling. I think that the difference today vis-a-vis Gaza relative to pre-October 7th is that we are watching it much more closely. Hamas was kind of sort of poo-pooed by the Israeli system over the years, and it's a whole subject in and of itself. In other words, the focus was on Hezbollah, it was on Iran, it was on other subjects. Hamas was always seen as this, well, they're an irritant threat, but nothing to really get terribly excited over. And as a result, one, intelligence resources were not fully dedicated to what was happening there. And analytically, and we saw this leading up to and into October 7th, even when there were indicators, they tended to be downplayed because the paradigm was Hamas is not really that kind of a threat. Yeah, they can make some trouble, they can be irritants, they can fire some rockets, but we don't really have to worry about them the way we have to worry about Hezbollah, for example. By the way, as an aside, something that's come up in my lectures over the past week, Sinwar didn't tell Nasrallah, Sinwar, head of Hamas, did not tell Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, the date of the planned attack, October 7th, primarily because he knew that Nasrallah's headquarters was thoroughly infiltrated by Israel, by the Mossad and military intelligence. And if he told him in advance, the secret would have been out. So the focus was Beirut, if you will, not Gaza. Now, fooled me once, shame on you, fooled me twice, shame on me. Now there is focus on Gaza. We have a much better idea what's going on in there. So stopping smuggling is important, but more important is seeing where stuff is going and where it's being built up. And if it is, stopping it there, preventing it, taking it out, and not letting it build up as we did over a nearly 15-year period at least until October 7th. We knew about a lot of it. I choose my words carefully. We didn't know certain things, but we knew about certain things. We knew they were producing rockets. We knew they were digging the tunnels, and there was a tunnel network. We even called it the Metro. We didn't know how extensive. We didn't know how deep. There were things we didn't know, but we knew about it. And now we're focused much more with an understanding of about takes you in a direction where you focus in and say, okay, I want to know what's happening there. And that wasn't being done prior. It's being done now.
Okay. I want to just open up for Q&A, and we'll take some of the questions that were in the chat. And if anyone else wants to ask a question live, if you want to just raise your hand, which you can do with the react button on the bottom of the screen. So I guess our question in the chat are going to take us back to the Iran discussion, which I think Murray, nice little back and forth going on between Murray and Talia Art. Thank you for the questions, which Murray was drawing a parallel to the Russo-Japan War and its role in taking down the Tsar, which I must admit, not my expertise, that particular war in history. But would humiliating Iran begin the process of regime replacement is the question. Talia, thank you. She argued it's a different world. Lessons from history don't always apply. Curious on your thoughts on that, Elliot, and would the lesson from history potentially apply here? I know we said the iron was hot 2 weeks ago, not right now, but let's spend a little more time on that since those are the questions.
Okay. So first of all, I think lessons of history are always important. They are never applicable one-to-one. I'm certainly a believer in George Santayana, who's often misquoted. The precise quote is, "He who cannot remember the past is condemned to repeat it." I'm sorry, people can fight tanks. They've done it. They've done it many times. You just have to know how to do it. But that's not really the question. The issue is not so much whether the Japanese weakened the Tsar as much as it was perceived that they had weakened the Tsar. Okay, and that perception is as important as what was done. The 12-day campaign in Iran may certainly, I would argue, most likely contributed to the uprising that we saw recently. That, once again, contributed. I don't believe in monocausal explanations. This happened and therefore this happened. Many things came together. I think social movements happened because of all sorts of things going on. And nobody knows, by the way, how they move from one stage to another. We can track them. It's one of the subjects that I've studied over the years. We can track the stages, but nobody really knows what makes them go from demonstrations to violent demonstrations, gatherings to riots, and so on and so forth. Again, there are certain variables that are there, but nobody knows what that switch is. What I would say now is that, having allowed that uprising to be crushed, the regime has reestablished itself as a power vis-a-vis its population. In other words, the impact of the 12-day campaign has been greatly reduced in the aftermath of the uprising. Nothing is totally eliminated. There's a memory of it. It could, but the direct effect has been lost. The regime has reinstated its power, and the perception of its power. The rebels are now in the retreat, and I'm talking about mentally in the retreat. They are being pursued. They're being sought out and arrested and executed. And right now they've shifted into survival mode. Once they shift into survival mode, we're not going to see another uprising in the immediate future, in my opinion. I could be wrong, but that's the pattern historically. And once again, just as the revolution in 2005 failed and took another near decade, over a decade, to come up again, the issues of the uprising are still there. But will it take another decade before they get their act together? That's not a prediction. That's just kind of an open question. If so, then we're talking about something else, a different era. In 1917, it was World War I. It was a continuing rot of the regime, but it still took over a decade before they were able to get it together and do it again.
And the question I just received here along these lines, Elliot, is just the sort of the silence in the world, from certainly on our campuses, the artist class,
Yes.
right? There's been a lot made of that. They stand up and protest for Palestinian rights, or so-called. And when it's about Iranians, suddenly they're silent. Any thoughts on that?
Look, they're silent about everything but Israel.
Right.
The I think that what we're seeing today, and I grew up in the U.S. I moved to Israel many years ago, but I continued a connection to the U.S. I have never seen the level of open, accepted, blatant, vicious anti-Semitism that I see today in the United States. And Europe, you could say, well, it hasn't reached Nazi level yet, but it's moving in that direction. Here, it's moving in that direction, and there's very much an undercurrent, left and right, of, well, the Iranian regime isn't so bad because they want to kill the Jews too. The Iranian regime, the only reason there was an uprising is because it was the Mossad. All of the attacks on the IRGC were Mossad agents. There were 200,000 Mossad agents in Iran, etc. And so, we support the Iranian regime against the Zionists was very much an undercurrent in that. So, part of it is framing, part of it is definitional. And if the Jews are the primary enemy, and if you've been, I know you're following this stuff. For those who see what's going on in social media, every problem in the world is the Jews. Once we eliminate the Jews, the world's going to be a wonderful place. Tucker Carlson's. I don't know anybody who was killed by Islamic radicals. We never had enemies in the Middle East until Israel and that kind of nonsense. If you start to buy into that, then you can see why people support the regime against the uprising.
And I want to just give you an opportunity to give us kind of any final thoughts before we wrap up? And which I know we always, whenever we have you on, it's always like we're sort of, we have a lot to touch on. You know, it's in a good way. We want to touch a little bit on lots of topics. But anything you didn't get a chance to touch on, anything we should be looking at as leaders and as supporters of Israel. Um,
Um, the you know what we're at a stage now where we just have to watch closely. There's so much going on. There are so many juggling balls in the air at once that I know for the past week or so, I've been doing much less, how can I put this, analysis per se, as much as watching, because the situation is so chaotic that even trying to get an idea. Let me try to focus on what I'm about to say. The American negotiations with Iran for tomorrow, going into tomorrow, um, can be boiled down to one of two possibilities, and the two possibilities are almost diametrically opposite. Okay, either Trump is doing it as a screen, in other words, he's already decided to strike, but he wants to make it look like he's being as open and forthcoming as possible, uh, knowing that the Iranians are not going to go along with it, and then he'll be able to say, as the Godfather famously says in the book, not in the movie, but nobody can reason with this fellow, and then there's going to be blood. I tried and I tried and I tried and I tried, but they're just unreasonable. So that's one possibility. And the other possibility is, when Witkoff told Netanyahu, we're not naive. Every naive person I know has always said they're not naive. Um, do they really think they can go in there and make a deal? And if the idea is to make a deal, and here again, I'm channeling Trump, the idea is to make a deal. When you make a deal, you compromise. And if you compromise and you end up, because the purpose is to make a deal, then we're in the diametrically opposite situation of the first one that I just mentioned. And honestly, I don't think anybody knows outside of Trump and maybe his tight inner circle which of the two it is.
Interesting. A lot to think about as we watch the news this weekend. Um, okay, well, thank you. I want to just before we wrap up, just to make a quick public service announcement, especially to the students that are on the line. And I see Liel, I see Yoav, I see others. We Hasbara is preparing to go to Israel again next this coming summer, May, June, and August. And applications are open and signups are underway. So please refer your friends, student leaders from all over the U.S. and Canada, as you know, can come with us, and I hope you'll spread the word, whether you're a student or whether you have a student in your family who is currently on a college campus. So thank you so much. And yes, I agree with what Stephen said in the chat. Great presentation. Thank you, Elliot. You always give us a lot to
My
think
pleasure
about.
as always.
And Mazel Tov to you, who you are in the States for your
Thank you.
grandson's bar mitzvah. So
Yes.
so Mazel Tov, and I
Thank
hope
you.
you can weather the cold coming from Israel to the East Coast.
It's cold. It's cold. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you again, and just
All right.
thanks everybody for joining us. It really means a lot, and we'll be looking forward to seeing you for the next one.
Absolutely. Look forward to it.
All right. Thanks again, Elliot. Thanks everyone for joining.
Bye bye.